The snowstorm didn't just fall, it attacked. A blinding white fury that wanted to swallow the whole world. Inside her tiny cabin, Clara Whitfield felt it trying to crawl through the walls. The fire was a joke, a weak orange pulse against a cold that felt ancient and alive. She'd been alone for years out here. So alone the silence had become a person, a mean old friend who never left. Tonight that friend was screaming in the wind. Her hands, white as the snow outside, pulled a faded shawl tighter. It was thin armor against the loneliness of the prairie. Then came the knock. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a fist against the wood, a sound that didn't belong in a storm this bad, a sound that meant trouble. Clara's heart did a little jump scare in her chest. Nobody came this far out. Nobody. Not unless they were running from something or running towards something they wanted to take. She got up, her bare feet cold on the floorboards. The knock came again, heavier this time. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't angry, but it wasn't going away. She stood frozen, staring at the door. Her whole life was built on staying quiet, staying invisible. Opening that door felt like setting fire to the only safety she had. But the thought of who might be out there, dying in the white hell of the storm, it was a thought she couldn't live with. With a hand that trembled like a leaf, she lifted the heavy wooden bar. The door groaned open and the storm lunged inside, a blast of snow and ice. 3 shapes stood there, giants made of winter and shadow. Snow clung to their shoulders, their long black hair crusted with frost. They were Apache, and they filled her doorway like 3 mountains that had just grown out of the ground. The one in front had a face carved from stone, his eyes dark and steady. He spoke, his voice low and calm, a rumble under the shriek of the wind. "Can we stay one night?" Just that. 4 simple words that could end her life. Every story she'd ever heard in town came rushing back. Vicious tales of raids and violence, whispered by folks who'd never seen an Apache up close. And here she was, a 23-year-old widow, the town's favorite piece of gossip, alone with 3 of them at her door. To say yes was to invite danger in. To say no, well, they were desperate men. Desperate men don't like the word no. The silence was deafening, just the wind howling its opinion. Her eyes darted between them. The leader, his gaze was watchful, but not cruel. The one behind him had sharper features, his eyes scanning everything, missing nothing. The third looked younger, the fight knocked out of him by the cold. Every instinct screamed at her. Slam the door, bar it, hide. But something else held her back. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in the way they stood, taking the storm's beating without flinching. Or maybe it was because she knew what it felt like to be on the outside, to be judged by whispers, to be left alone to face the storm. She took a step back, a silent invitation. They entered without a word, bringing the cold and the night in with them. She shut the door, and the sound of the bar sliding home was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. It wasn't just locking the storm out. It was locking herself in with them. The cabin, her whole world, suddenly felt tiny, the air thick with their presence. She retreated to the far side of the fire, her shawl wrapped around her like a shield. The leader gave a small nod. Not thanks, just an acknowledgement. The second man knelt by the fire, his hands outstretched to the pathetic flames. The third leaned against the wall and let out a long, slow breath, like he'd been holding it for 100 miles. For a long time, nobody spoke. The fire crackled. The wind howled. Clara watched them, trying to read the lines on their faces. Had she just made the worst mistake of her life? Her pulse was a frantic drum against her ribs. But then she noticed something strange. Their stillness. They didn't move toward her. They didn't touch her things. They just existed. A powerful, contained energy that wasn't threatening. Not yet, anyway. But the town's judgment was a ghost in the room with them. Clara Whitfield, the pretty young widow. Letting 3 strange men into her home, the scandal would be a feast for them. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to breathe. When she opened them, the leader was watching her. Not with hunger, not with menace. It was a look of measurement, of understanding. Their eyes locked, and for a split second, She felt like he could see right through her. He saw the loneliness. He saw the exile. He knew. Then he looked away, back toward the shuttered window, and the connection was broken. But she had felt it, and it terrified her more than any threat. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on her cot, staring into the darkness, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing mixed with the storm's rage. Every creak of the cabin made her jump. But as the hours dragged on, a strange feeling began to settle in her bones. The cabin didn't feel empty anymore. The crushing loneliness that was her constant companion had eased. It was still there, but it wasn't screaming in her ear. She was still afraid, but for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't completely alone in the storm. As her eyes finally started to close, she had a chilling thought. This wasn't just about one night. That knock on the door hadn't just broken her solitude. It had kicked her life onto a different path, and she had no idea where it was leading. The morning light was pale and watery. The storm had quieted to a whisper. Clara woke with a start, the memory of the night before crashing down on her. She sat up, clutching her shawl, her heart pounding. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. She looked toward the hearth. They were gone. For a wild moment, relief washed over her. It was over. It was just a strange dream. She got up, her feet unsteady, and went to the door. The bar was lifted. They'd left as silently as they'd come. She pushed the door open, blinking against the bright, clean world of new snow. And then she froze. They weren't gone. Not at all. The leader, the one whose eyes saw too much, was in her small yard, splitting firewood with a steady, powerful rhythm. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was solid and real. The second man was coming from the creek, carrying 2 full buckets of water, his breath pluming in the icy air. And the third, the younger one, was kneeling by her broken fence, carefully mending the slats with strips of leather. Clara just stood there staring. She hadn't asked them to do this. She had expected them to be ghosts, vanished with the dawn, leaving only their tracks in the snow. But here they were, working, tending to her broken-down life like it was their own. It wasn't kindness. It felt like something else. Something calculated. Fear was easy. Fear was a wall she could hide behind. But this quiet, unexpected industry, it left her exposed. She stepped outside, the snow crunching under her boots. The man splitting wood paused. Tasa, she remembered he'd called himself. He nodded at her, just once. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't unfriendly. It was just acknowledgement, like he was checking something off a list. The second man, Nantan, set the water buckets by her door without a word, his movements precise and economical. The third, Dason, looked up from the fence and gave her a quick, almost shy smile before looking away. It was the smile that unnerved her the most. It was too genuine, too human. Thanks, she mumbled, the word feeling stupid and small in the vast cold air. Inside, she made them porridge, stretching the last of her cornmeal with extra water. It was a pathetic offering. She set the 3 bowls on the table. They came in and ate without a word, their focus on the food absolute. They didn't look at her. They didn't look around the room, but she could feel them noticing everything. The worn-out broom, the patched-up roof, the way her hands trembled as she poured herself a cup of water. These weren't just weary travelers. They were something else, and their silence was starting to feel less like respect and more like a strategy. Later that morning, she knew she had to go to town. She was out of flour, out of oil, out of excuses. Riding in, she felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back. The whispers started before she even tied up her horse. Mrs. Pike, the town's self-appointed moral compass, was standing on the mercantile porch, her arms crossed. "Quite a bit of smoke coming from your chimney last night, Clara," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "For a woman all alone in a storm." The other women with her tittered, their laughter like chipping ice. Clara's face burned. She ignored them, her jaw tight, and went inside to buy her things. Every clink of coin on the counter felt like an accusation. She got what she needed and left, the weight of their judgment a physical thing on her shoulders. She didn't look back, but as she rode out of town, she had the distinct feeling she was being watched. Not by the gossiping women, by someone else, someone she couldn't see. When she got back to the cabin, the woodpile was stacked taller than it had been in years. The fence was fully repaired. Nantan was tending the fire, which now roared with a healthy, steady heat. It was better. Her home was stronger, warmer, more secure than it had been when she woke up. They were improving it, fortifying it. Why? The question echoed in the new comfortable warmth of the cabin. That night, Dason was whittling a small piece of wood by the fire. He started humming, a low, sad tune. Then softly he began to sing. The words were in his own language, a sound like flowing water and shifting stones. But the feeling was grief, a deep, profound sorrow that made the air in the cabin feel heavy. Clara found herself holding her breath, her sewing forgotten in her lap. The song ended, and the silence that followed was thick with unspoken pain. "It's a mourning song," Dason said quietly, not looking at her. "For a friend." Clara didn't know what to say, but a cold knot of dread was tightening in her stomach. A friend. The way he said it, it felt recent. It felt raw. The next morning, while fetching water, her foot hit something in the snow near the woodpile. She bent down and brushed the powder away. It was a small leather pouch. Frowning, she picked it up. It was heavy. She opened it, and her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a bullet, but not just any bullet. It was misshapen, flattened on one side and stained with something dark. Something that looked like dried blood. It had been dug out of something, or someone. She looked up at the cabin, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the neatly stacked wood, at the mended fence. It all clicked into place with a sickening snap. They weren't running from the storm. They were running from a fight. And one of them was hurt. Badly. She shoved the pouch into her pocket, her mind racing. Who was hurt? Where? She scanned them as they worked. Taza moved with power, Dason with grace. But Nantan, she noticed it now. He moved stiffly. He favored his left side. He never lifted his left arm above his shoulder. They weren't just travelers seeking shelter. They were soldiers, fugitives, and they had brought their war right to her doorstep. That night, the tension in the cabin was a living thing. Clara could feel it coiling in the shadows, a snake ready to strike. She knew their secret now, or at least part of it. The bloody bullet was a heavy weight in her pocket. Nantan sat hunched by the fire, his face pale in the flickering light. He was trying to hide it, but she could see the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the slight tremor in his hand. He was in pain, a lot of it. She couldn't stand it anymore. The silence, the secrets. They were going to tear her apart. After Dasan and Taza had settled into a feigned sleep on the floor, Clara moved. She filled a basin with warm water from the kettle and grabbed the small box of medical supplies her husband had left behind. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs. She knelt beside Nantan. "Let me see it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. He just stared into the flames, his jaw set like granite. "I know you're hurt," she pressed, her voice a little stronger. "I found the bullet. You're no good to anyone if you let the wound fester." His eyes finally flicked to hers. They were filled with a dark, weary pain, but also a sliver of surprise. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his left shoulder toward her. She gently pushed aside the heavy fabric of his shirt. Her breath hitched. The wound was ugly. A ragged, inflamed gash high on his shoulder, crudely stitched with what looked like sinew. It was red and swollen, angry-looking. It was infected. "This needs to be cleaned," she said, her voice shaking slightly. She worked in silence, her hands surprisingly steady. She cut away the rough stitches, cleaned the wound as best she could with soap and water, and applied a poultice of herbs. Nantan never made a sound, but she could feel the rigid tension in his body, the tight control he held over his pain. As she wrapped a clean strip of linen around his shoulder, Taza's voice cut through the quiet. "You have a healer's touch." She jumped, startled. She hadn't realized he was awake. He was sitting up, watching them from across the room, his face an unreadable mask in the dim light. My father was a doctor, she said quietly, tying off the bandage. He taught me some things. Taza just nodded slowly, his eyes boring into her. It wasn't a thank you, it was an assessment. He was reevaluating her, seeing her as something more than just a lonely woman who had opened her door in a storm. He was seeing her as a potential asset, or a potential threat. The thought sent a chill down her spine. The next day, the atmosphere had changed. The invisible wall between her and them had cracked. They still didn't talk much, but their silence felt different. Less guarded, Dason would occasionally offer her a small, grateful smile. Even Taza's gaze seemed to hold a flicker of something new. Respect, maybe, but the mystery only deepened. Why were they here? Who had shot Nantan? What were they running from? That evening, as Dason hummed another of his sad, haunting melodies, Clara decided to push. She held up the small carved bird he'd been whittling. "This is beautiful," she said. He nodded, his fingers still working the wood. "My daughter," he said, his voice thick. She loved birds. Loved. Past tense. The word hung in the air like smoke. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he looked up, and his eyes were filled with a grief so vast it seemed to swallow the firelight. "They took her," he said, his voice breaking. "Soldiers. They came to our village. They took the children." A wave of cold horror washed over Clara. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was something much, much worse. "And your friend," she said, her voice trembling as she pieced it together. "The one you sing the morning song for?" "He tried to stop them," Dason said, his knuckles white as he gripped the piece of wood. "He died trying to save my little bird." Now Taza spoke, his voice a low growl from the shadows. "We are not running," he said, and his words were chips of ice. "We are hunting. The men who did this, they will pay." The raw vengeance in his voice was terrifying. These were not just fugitives. They were avengers. And Nantan had been wounded in their quest for justice. Clara's little cabin, her forgotten corner of the world, had just become the hiding place for three men on a mission of blood and retribution. And she was right in the middle of it. The next night, as they spoke in low tones in their own language, a language that was becoming familiar to her ears, she heard a word that made the blood freeze in her veins. She didn't know much of the Apache tongue, but she knew names. And the name they spoke, in a hushed, urgent whisper, was a name she knew all too well. Whitfield. They said her husband's name. The world tilted. Her husband's name. In their language. Why? What did James have to do with any of this? He was a farmer, a simple, quiet man who had died of a fever 2 winters ago. Wasn't he? A thousand forgotten details suddenly rushed back at her. James's long trips, supposedly to trade for supplies. The strangers he would sometimes meet at the edge of their property, speaking in low voices. The extra money he sometimes had, money he couldn't explain. She had pushed the questions away back then. She had wanted to believe in the simple life he'd promised her. Now, his whole life, their whole life together, felt like a lie. She had to know. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her heart, but the need to understand was stronger. She waited until Nantan and Dason were outside, checking traps they'd set. Taza was alone, sharpening a knife by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of a stone on steel filling the silence. Clara took a deep breath. "You knew my husband," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Taza didn't stop sharpening the knife. His movements were steady, deliberate. Scrape, scrape, scrape. "He was a trader," Taza said finally, his eyes fixed on the blade. "He traded with many people." "What did he trade?" she pressed, her voice trembling. "What did he trade with you?" Taza set the knife down. He looked up at her, and his face was grim. "He was not the man you thought he was, Clara." The way he said her name, for the first time, sent a shiver through her. It was a warning. "He made promises," Taza continued, his voice low and dangerous. "He made a deal with my people. He was a guide, an interpreter. He promised to help us find a safe path for our families, away from the soldiers." "Help you?" Clara was confused. "But the townspeople, they all said..." The townspeople know nothing. Taza cut her off. They see only what they are told to see. Your husband saw an opportunity. He took our gold. He promised us safe passage. He paused, and the look in his eyes was like staring into a deep, dark well. And then he sold us to the very soldiers he promised to protect us from. The air left Clara's lungs. It couldn't be true. James? Her James? Betrayal? It was a poison that seeped into every memory she had of him. His smile, his touch, all of it tainted. The soldiers came, Taza said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Dayson's daughter was taken. My brother, the friend Dayson mourns, was killed. Nantan took a bullet trying to get them out. So that was it. The truth. It was uglier than anything she could have imagined. Her husband wasn't just a liar. He was a monster. He had traded human lives for gold. Dayson's daughter, Taza's brother. Their grief wasn't just grief. It was a fire, fueled by her husband's treachery. Why are you here? She whispered, her mind reeling. Are you here for revenge? Against me? Taza shook his head slowly. Your husband had a partner, the man who led the soldiers, a man they called the Major. James was supposed to give him something, a map to a silver mine on our sacred land. But your husband cheated his partner too. He hid the map before the soldiers came. He hid it. Here, Taza said, his gaze sweeping the small cabin. Somewhere in this house, the Major wants it. He believes you know where it is. That's who we are running from. That's who we are hunting. The Major. Suddenly, the hostile stares in town made a terrifying new kind of sense. The feeling of being watched. They weren't just gossiping about her. They were searching, waiting. The Major's men. And they thought she had the map. I don't know anything about a map, she said, her voice shaking. I swear. We believe you, Taza said. But the Major does not. And then it happened. A sound from outside that cut through the still air. The crunch of multiple boots on snow, the low murmur of voices, and the telltale flicker of lantern light against the shuttered window. They were here. Judgment hadn't come for the widow shacking up with savages. It had come for the map. The storm had passed, but the real blizzard was just about to hit. The cabin went silent. The crackling fire was the only sound. Taza was on his feet in an instant, the knife back in his hand, his body a coiled spring of deadly intent. Through a crack in the shutters, Clara could see them. A dozen men, townsfolk. But they weren't the ones in charge. In front of them, tall and broad in a heavy winter coat, was a man she'd never seen before. He had a scarred face and cold, dead eyes that seemed to suck the light from the lanterns around him. The Major. They know, Clara breathed, her words turning to ice in her throat. Dayson and Nantan burst back through the door, their faces grim. They'd seen them too. Bar the door, Taza commanded, his voice a low growl. Dayson slammed the heavy wooden bar into place just as a fist hammered on the other side. Clara Whitfield, the Major's voice was a whip crack in the cold night. I know you're in there, and I know who you're with. Send them out, and I might just let you live. Her whole body was trembling. This was it, a standoff. Her tiny cabin was the only thing between Taza's quest for vengeance and the Major's greed, and she was trapped in the middle. The pounding came again, harder this time, rattling the whole cabin. He's not bluffing, Nantan said, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his belt. We saw his men. They're armed for a war. Clara looked around the small room, her home. It had been a prison of loneliness, and now it was a fortress under siege. The map. Everything was about the map. Her mind raced, desperately trying to remember anything, any clue James might have left. He was a meticulous man. He loved puzzles, secret compartments. He had built this cabin himself. Every floorboard, every stone in the hearth, he could have hidden it anywhere. Think, Clara, Taza's voice was urgent. Did he have a place he kept things? A loose stone? A hollow book? She shook her head, tears of panic blurring her vision. I don't know. He was a stranger to me. The Major's voice boomed again. Last chance, Clara. The map. Give me the map your thieving husband stole, and this all ends. Stole. He had stolen it from the Apache, and then stolen it again from his own partner in crime. James, the man she had loved, the man she had mourned. He was a ghost who was about to get her killed. Dason moved to her side, his presence surprisingly calming in the chaos. "We will not let them harm you," he said softly. But Clara knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. There were 3 of them, and a dozen men outside, all of them with rifles. Then she saw it, something she hadn't thought about in years. On the rough-hewn mantel above the fireplace, there was a row of small decorative stones James had placed there. He'd said they were from a riverbed he liked, but one of them was different. It wasn't smooth like the others. It had a strange, unnatural seam running through it. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pointed, her hand shaking. "The mantle," she whispered. "That stone." Taza's eyes followed her finger. He moved to the fireplace in 2 quick strides. He picked up the stone. It was heavier than it looked. With a grunt, he smashed it against the hearth. It broke in 2. It was hollow, and nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, tightly rolled piece of parchment. The map. A wave of dizziness washed over her. It had been right there, in front of her, for 2 years. A hidden secret that held the fate of everyone in this room. Taza unrolled it. It was a crude drawing of the surrounding hills, marked with symbols she didn't understand. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at her. "He was a fool," Taza said, his voice laced with contempt. "To hide it in plain sight." Sekrum, outside, the shouting grew more impatient. A heavy log slammed against the door, making the wood groan in protest. They were trying to break it down. "We have to do something," Dason said, pulling out a long, wicked-looking knife. "We cannot win a fight like this," Nantan countered, his hand on his wounded shoulder. "Not here. We're trapped." Taza looked from the map to the door, his mind working. Then he looked at Clara. "There is one way," he said, his eyes burning with a sudden, desperate idea. "But it is dangerous, and it depends on you." "Me?" Clara's voice was a squeak. "What can I do?" "You are going to give him what he wants," Taza said, his voice low and urgent. "Or you are going to make him think you are." He explained the plan quickly, his words sharp and precise. It was insane. It was reckless. It was almost certainly going to get them all killed. But it was better than waiting here to die. She had to walk out there, alone. She had to face the Major and convince him she would give him the map, but only on her terms. It was a performance, and her life was the price of admission if she failed. Her legs felt like water, but she nodded. The years of being the town's quiet, invisible widow were over. James had made her a victim. Taza was giving her a chance to be something else. A weapon. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "All right," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Bar the door behind me, and be ready." She looked at the 3 men who had turned her life upside down. The hunted, the avengers. In their dark, determined eyes, she didn't see savages. She saw a reflection of her own caged fury, a fury that was finally, after years of silence, about to be unleashed. Taza handed her the map. Its edges felt sharp, dangerous. This small piece of paper had caused so much death, so much pain. Now it was her only shield. She walked to the door, her heart a wild drum. Dason pulled the bar away. The cold night air hit her face. She stepped out into the ring of hostile lanterns, into the cold, dead eyes of the Major, and prayed she would live to see the dawn. The night was suddenly silent. All the shouting stopped. A dozen pairs of eyes stared at her, a lone woman in a simple dress, standing on the porch of her cabin, bathed in the flickering orange glow of their lanterns. The Major stood a few feet away, a cruel smirk twisting his scarred face. He was bigger than he'd looked from the window, a brute of a man who radiated a casual violence. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice dripping with false charm. "The little mouse comes out of her hole. Have you come to your senses?" Clara clutched the map in her hand, the parchment crinkling. Her throat was so dry she could barely swallow. She had to remember Tassa's words. "Be strong. Be defiant. He preys on weakness." "I have the map," she said, her voice ringing out in the cold air, surprisingly clear and steady. "But it's mine now. My husband left this cabin, and everything in it, to me." The major's smirk faltered. He took a step closer. That map is not yours, little girl. It belongs to me. Your husband was a thief who got what he deserved. Now give it to me before I lose my patience. Behind him, the townsfolk shifted nervously. They were farmers and shopkeepers, not killers. They had come for a scandal, but this was something else entirely. They were out of their depth. This was Clara's only advantage. No, she said, lifting her chin. I'll give it to you, but not here. She remembered the next part of the plan, the bluff. The map is old, fragile. It describes a place, a landmark near the old canyon. I'll take you there. I'll show you the entrance to the mine myself. But you have to give me your word that you'll let me go and you'll leave these men alone. She was banking on his greed. The map was one thing, but a personal guide to a silver mine was something he couldn't resist. He wanted to be sure. He didn't want to waste time searching. The major stared at her, his eyes narrowing, trying to read her. Was she bluffing? Was it a trap? The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. And how do I know you're not leading us into an ambush? He sneered. You have my word, Clara said, her voice laced with a bitterness that wasn't entirely fake. My husband betrayed you. He betrayed them. She nodded toward the cabin. I owe allegiance to no one. All I want is to be left alone. The silver is your payment for that. It was a masterful lie, crafted by Taza from the ugly truth. It sounded believable because parts of it were true. The major considered it. He glanced back at his men, then back at her. The thought of all that silver just waiting for him was a powerful lure. All right, little mouse, he said finally. We'll play it your way. At dawn you lead us to the canyon, but my men will have their rifles on you every step of the way. And your Apache friends? They stay locked in that cabin. If I see even one of them, the deal is off, and you're the first to die. Understand? I understand, Clara said, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had bought them time. She turned without another word and went back inside, shutting the door behind her. She leaned against it, her body trembling with adrenaline. Tassa, Nanten, and Dason were watching her, their faces tense. He agreed, she breathed. Tassa nodded, a flicker of grim approval in his eyes. You did well. Now, we prepare. The rest of the night was a blur of quiet, frantic activity. While the major's men set up a perimeter around the cabin, Taza unrolled the map on the table. He wasn't looking at the markings for the mine. He was looking at the terrain itself, the ridges, the ravines, the choke points. He was a warrior planning a battlefield. The canyon he speaks of, Taza murmured, his finger tracing a line on the parchment. It is a bad place. Narrow passages, easy to set a trap. He will have a dozen men with rifles, Nantan reminded him, and they will be watching her every move. They will be watching her, Taza corrected him. They will not be watching the rocks above or the shadows behind. He explained the rest of the plan. It was even more dangerous than the first part. While Clara led the major and his men on a slow, deliberate path to the canyon, the three of them would slip out of the cabin and use their knowledge of the land to get ahead of them. There was a loose board in the floor at the back of the cabin, hidden under her cot. It led to a small crawl space, and from there, to an opening hidden by a thicket of winter brush. It was an escape route James had built, a coward's exit. Tonight, it would be a warrior's path. As dawn approached, casting a gray, bleak light over the snow, it was time. Clara's stomach was a tight knot of terror. She looked at the three men. Their faces were smeared with mud and ash, blending them into the shadows. They were ghosts already. Dason came to her and gently placed a small, carved wooden bird in her hand, the one he had been whittling. For luck, he whispered, and for my little bird. Today, we get justice for her. The simple gesture, the weight of the smooth wood in her palm, gave her a sliver of strength. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for a little girl she had never met. It was time. Taza gave her a final intense look. Do not show fear, Clara. You are the hawk now, not the mouse. She nodded, tucked the bird into her pocket, and opened the door. The major was waiting, his horse snorting impatiently in the cold air. His men were mounted, rifles held ready. Their faces were grim. "Time to go," the major said, his eyes scanning her for any sign of deception. She walked toward them, her head held high, the map clutched in her hand. As she passed the woodpile, she didn't look back. She just prayed that Tassa, Nantan, and Dason had made it out. She was leading these men to a trap, and she was the bait. The journey to the canyon was slow and agonizing. Clara walked in front, the major riding close behind her, the cold muzzle of his rifle never far from her back. His men flanked them, their eyes constantly scanning the snow-covered landscape. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind made her heart leap into her throat. Were they out there? Had they made it? Or was she leading herself to her own execution? She followed the path Tassa had shown her on the map, a winding route that led them through thick stands of pine and across frozen streams. It was designed to be slow, to give them time. The major grew impatient. "Are you sure you know where you're going?" He grumbled, his voice rough. "It's not far now," Clara said, forcing a calmness she didn't feel into her voice. "The canyon entrance is just past this ridge. It's hidden. You would never find it without me." She could feel his greed warring with his suspicion. She kept her pace steady, her eyes fixed forward. She thought about Dason's daughter. She thought about Tassa's brother. She thought about the 2 years she had spent mourning a lie. A cold, hard anger began to burn away her fear. James had made this mess, but she was going to be the one to finish it. They finally reached the ridge overlooking the canyon. It was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, its walls steep and treacherous. The entrance was a narrow slit between two massive rock formations, barely wide enough for a horse to pass through. It was a perfect bottleneck, a perfect kill zone. "There," Clara said, pointing. "That's the entrance. The mine is about a quarter-mile in." The major stared down at it, his eyes gleaming. He could practically smell the silver. His caution was being consumed by his avarice. This was the moment Tassa had been waiting for. "All right," the major barked at his men. "2 of you stay up here with the horses, the rest of you with me, and keep your eyes on the girl." They dismounted and started the treacherous climb down into the canyon. The path was steep and covered in loose shale. Clara moved carefully, deliberately, making them slow down. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm. Any second now. It had to be any second. They reached the bottom and entered the narrow passage. The rock walls rose high on either side, blocking out the sun. The air was cold and still. The men bunched up behind her, their rifles held at the ready, their nervousness palpable. This place felt like a tomb. Clara stopped. "This is it," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "This is as far as I go. The mine is just ahead. Give me a horse and I'll be on my way." The major laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You fool! Did you really think I'd let you go? You know too much." He raised his rifle. The dark hole of the barrel pointed right at her heart. "You and your husband, both thieves, both ending up in the same dirt. Now, the map." This was it, the final desperate gamble. She held out the map, and as he reached for it, she screamed a single word. "Now!" From the rocks above, an arrow whistled through the air, silent and deadly. It struck one of the major's men in the throat. He gurgled, dropping his rifle, and fell to the ground. Before anyone could react, Nantan appeared from behind a boulder, a knife flashing in each hand. He moved like a whirlwind of silent death, taking down 2 more men before they could even raise their guns. Dason was above them, a phantom on the canyon rim, sending a relentless volley of arrows into their ranks. The townsfolk panicked. They were not soldiers. They fired their rifles wildly, their shots echoing like thunder in the narrow passage, the bullets ricocheting off the rock walls. Taza descended from the cliffs like a mountain lion, landing directly behind the major. The major spun around, his face a mask of shock and rage, and fired his rifle. But Taza was too fast. He deflected the barrel with his arm, and the shot went wide. The 2 men crashed together in a brutal, desperate struggle. Clara scrambled for cover behind a rock as chaos erupted around her. The townsfolk, seeing their numbers dwindling, broke and ran, scrambling back up the path, their greed forgotten in their terror. Now it was just the major, locked in combat with Tassa. Nantan and Dason stood ready, but this was Tassa's fight, his justice. The Major was bigger and heavier, but Tassa was faster, fiercer. They rolled on the ground, knives flashing. The Major roared with pain as Tassa's blade sliced his arm. He kicked Tassa away and scrambled for his dropped rifle. He got his hand on it. He raised it, a triumphant sneer on his face, but he never got to pull the trigger. With a defiant cry, Clara burst from behind the rock. She still had the heavy, hollowed-out stone she'd carried from the cabin, the one that had hidden the map. She swung it with all her might, smashing it against the side of the Major's head. He crumpled to the ground, stunned. Taza was on him in a heartbeat, his knife at the man's throat. The fight was over. The silence that fell was broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing. Taza looked at the Major, his eyes burning with the fire of a justice long delayed. "This is for my brother," he said, his voice low and cold, "and for all the children you have stolen." Then he looked up at Clara. He saw not a frightened widow, but a warrior who had stood her ground. He nodded, a sign of ultimate respect. The justice that followed was swift and final. They left the Major and his men in the canyon, a grim monument to their own greed. They retrieved the rifles and supplies, then faded back into the hills, their quest finally over. Back at the cabin, the air felt different, lighter. The ghosts of the past had been exorcised by the violence of the present. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple, Tassa, Nantan, and Dason prepared to leave. They were no longer fugitives. They were victors. Dason came to Clara and took her hands in his. "We can never repay you," he said, his eyes filled with a deep, sincere gratitude. "You have the heart of a lion." Nantan, the silent, wounded warrior, simply bowed his head to her, a gesture more powerful than any words. Taza stood before her last. "The silver in that mine is a curse," he said. "Forget it. Forget your husband. Start a new life, Clara. You have earned it." She watched them walk away, three figures melting into the vast open wilderness. They didn't look back. She stood on her porch, the cold air on her face, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The cabin wasn't a prison anymore. It was a home. Her home. She had faced down the whispers of the town and the guns of greedy men. She had stared into the darkness of her own past and had not flinched. The world would still judge, of course. Tongues would still wag. But Clara Whitfield no longer cared about their whispers. She had found her own voice in the storm, and it was louder than any of them. Dignity isn't something the world gives you. It's something you claim, with fire and with courage. It's born in the choices you make when you're trapped between the storm outside and the storm within. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Clara's place.